OK， 那我们就开始了。因为同时的话，我们也会有线上的直播。等一下，如果大家有人想用手机看啊，或者是临时出去的话，也可以 catch up。OK， 那各位领导、各位嘉宾，还有媒体朋友以及线上的观众朋友们，大家下午好！欢迎大家来到本次活动的现场，一起开启运河万科中心与 Archidocs 驻格传媒共同举办的国际设计力量的首次沙龙。那也是第7届发条节设计向前一步的运河会场。我是今天的主持人 Archidocs 驻格传媒的主理人丽希，谢谢大家的到来。早在20世纪，著名的城市规划学家 Patrick Geddes 呢，在他的《进化中的城市》中提到，他已经在描绘一个理想中的未来城市。它是什么样的呢？从无序的蔓延到自由有机的生长，从单一的功能规划到多元的生态的融合。那么多年之后的今天，我们所期待的城市的发展又是怎样的呢？我们其实希望它不仅仅或者说不是盲目的扩张，而是要像一朵花一样，能够自然的生长，顺应自然。未来可以和谐的盛开。那么在杭州，大家今天能够感受到杭州的一个热情。当然，虽然在下雨，但是我们的活动的心情是很热烈的。所以，杭州呢是一座拥有丰富历史文化遗产的城市。在全球化和城市化的进程当中，它肩负着城市发展以及文化传承的双重使命和责任。那么在这座城市中，大家所处的这个场地周边呢，其实是京杭大运河。它不仅仅是一条自然的水道，更承载着这片土地的历史与记忆，同时呢，也在助力和推动杭州的城市的未来发展。那12月份呢，正好是杭州万科第7届发条节的时机，也是万科历年来在探索产业发展的一个重要的品牌活动。那相信在座的各位也感受到了，2024年的时候，它是变化和复杂的一年，同时呢，也是机遇与挑战的一年。我们也在思考说，如何为城市和产业带来更多的动能。那本届的发条节也是提出了向前一步这样的口号和命题，希望在不同的领域可以邀请到能够积极向前一步、探寻解题思路的行业先锋。那么面对困境，我们可以一起来探讨城市、产业以及个人如何向前的动能。作为国际设计力量沙龙的第1期，这次的主题正如屏幕所示，是 运河，也就是重新思考运河可持续。探索有机更新的未来路径，所以我们希望能够用可持续和城市再利用这个核心思想，对嘉宾以及在座的各位提出一个设问，就是未来我们应该如何去更新城市，如何应对城市化的进程。所以我们今天齐聚在这里呢，也是希望能够找到一个解决方案，或者说为这个困境打开思路。那在主旨演讲之前呢，请允许我来介绍一下今天出席的各位嘉宾，他们分别是杭州运河万科中心项目负责人 C-Works 设计产业社区的发起人谢思成先生，欢迎。英国知名建筑事务所 Foster+Partners 高级合伙人 Martin Castle 先生 ，Welcome。美国知名建筑事务所 NBBJ 董事、设计总监胡伟先生，欢迎。中国美术学院教授、博导，中国建筑文化研究会副会长于坚老师。以及 Foster+Partners 合伙人、杭州办公室负责人黄绮珊女士 ，UAD 浙江大学建筑设计研究院国际设计中心主持建筑师门格先生，还有等一下会加入我们的01城市建筑事务所合伙人、中国美术学院副教授，以及浙江省创意设计协会青年设计师联合会的会长詹远先生。那么首先呢，我们邀请主办方的代表，也是运河万科中心的项目负责人谢总来致开幕词，有请。
好，尊敬的各位来宾，欢迎大家在这样一个寒冷的下午，来到我们运河能力或者更加有能级的平台， 叫做 C-Works 平台。那在这个平台上，我们把这个园区里面跟建筑、跟室内、跟软装、跟材料相关的所有的这个供应链的企业整合在了一起。那我们希望在这个平台里面呢，大家能够一起共赢。那特别荣幸的就是说，今年我们试运营了这样差不多半年的时间吧，我们这个平台的签约额啊，已经差不多有小1000万了。所以这一点也是我特别愿意看到的，也是我们运河万科中心一直以来有一句特别核心的思想，叫做把用户的成本中心变成利润中心啊，就是让大家在这里交的每一分租金，最后都能转化成自己的业务啊。所以基于运河万科中心我们在设计产业的这样一个深厚的积淀和蓬勃发展的这个态势，那我们25年呢，希望做一些在行业内更有深度的一些活动，能够为园区的企业乃至杭州设计的企业提供更加广阔的交流平台。这次我们携手了 Archidog 驻格传媒，共同举办了国际设计力量的这个系列沙龙。我们邀请了著名的国际的事务所、国内顶尖院校的学者以及众多杰出的这个企业和个人聚集一堂，共同探讨全球范围内的设计实践成果和发展趋势。我们期望通过这样的交流和碰撞，不仅能够显著地扩大我们运河设计圈在国内外的影响力，更能够借助与知名事务所的深度的合作，为我们广大的设计企业和从业者搭建一个汲取国际化设计理念的高端的分享平台，启发本土的设计创作，同时推动行业的发展和变革，为行业的发展突破提供新的思路。那今天呢，其实是我们国际设计沙龙的第1期，我们聚焦在城市更新这样一个话题。我们请到了 Foster Partners、NBPJ、中国美院和 UAD， 包括01城市等等，在国际以及在杭州都非常知名的事务所和国内的一些设计先锋，为我们带来这样一场顶级的学术设计交流。我相信今天的分享一定是干货满满、精彩纷呈。最后，我预祝今天的活动圆满成功，谢谢大家。
感谢谢总，也非常的可以接受他的这个祝福，然后希望我们这次的活动可以圆满的成功。那正如谢总所说，这次的国际设计力量蕊运河系列呢，我们希望以国际化和本土性为主题，来邀请到国际的知名事务所以及我们杭州自己的设计院、设计公司，还有国际的这个知名院校的学者一起来探讨这些话题。那么这些话题呢，我们也希望能够发掘杭州本地的地域文化，改善提高城市的面貌以及人居的生活环境。那超越设计本身这样的一些探讨呢，我们也希望能够唤醒大家对于设计行业的热情以及革新的魄力。那今天的话，我们也希望这样的一个开放交流的平台，能够带来一些更深度的思考。那这个思考呢，也是我刚刚在前面提到的，对于各位嘉宾的一个问句，就是城市还能怎么更新？那么我们接下来进入到最重要的环节，也就是今天的主旨分享。那我来先介绍一下第一位的分享嘉宾，Foster+Partners 高级合伙人 Martin Castle 先生。So Martin, I will do a very quick introduction, and the stage will be all yours. So Martin 呢，他是2002年就加入了 Foster， 他呢其实参与到了 Foster 在全球各地的很多重要的项目，其中呢也包括我们杭州的城市重要新中心的中轴线城市设计，以及欧美金融城，也就是大家非常了解的几个重要的项目。那 Martin 的话，我们也希望问他的问题是关于在历史保护街区以及城市肌理已经非常具有特色的地方，比如说杭州啊，那面对这些新的项目，未来的一些新的产业以及活力的需求，您觉得城市还能怎么样更新？那我们也希望 Martin 在他的主题分享 The most sustainable building is the one that already exists 中可以找到答案。有请 Martin， Welcome。
Thank you very much. I want to talk today about something that's I'm quite passionate about, and So the statement, the most sustainable building is one that already exists. This is a statement by Carl Elefante. And what he was saying was, if we knock a building down, we release carbon emissions into the environment. And then we emit more carbon emissions, replacing it with something else. So why don't we work with the existing buildings and make them better? And that's the premise of what I want to talk about today, about how some of our projects are either working with historic buildings or in historic contexts. I love this picture because we've got in the 1990s, the Prime Minister of Britain, John Major, saying the best future for Britain, while in the background they're knocking down bits of heritage that could have been preserved. So I kind of find it ironic, and I think, particularly with industrial heritage, there's a lot that we can do to reuse it. So the first project, the British Museum, this is an old institution, and it's been around in London for a long time, but like most institutions, they need a refresh once in a while. And what happens very often with old buildings, they accumulate mini extensions, bits get added on, and they become quite messy and confused. So our approach was to strip away all the bits that weren't inherent in the original, and then create this great court in the center. And so you can see, by stripping away the unnecessary bits, what happens is we create a whole new space for the public. And this has become one of the most popular tourist attractions in London now, and it's a major square in itself. Another view to the side, you can see the bits that have been added on to the side and then stripped away. And you can see, by really understanding the buildings you're working with, how you can really shape them into something new. Again, a sort of 1960s addition there, stripped away. And not only does it create space, it also enhances the appreciation of the original building itself. And perhaps most importantly, this has become a square in the city, so it's linking together this whole network of spaces throughout London. And so instead of being a barrier, now it's another public space for everyone. So I think how we can creatively reuse these buildings can make a difference. Something which seemingly seems quite simple was in Trafalgar Square, where we closed off a road, and that sounds relatively simple in itself. And it created this amazing space, and Trafalgar Square was effectively a roundabout, and now we're turning it into a major public plaza. But for that to happen took an incredible amount of analysis, and we were 27,000 drivers were questioned, accident analysis, traffic analysis. So much detailed work had to happen to make that a reality. And of course, all the public consultations that we had to undergo. So although it was just a case of shutting a road, it was an incredible amount of work. But the result is, before it was completely closed off. Now we get the public moving in, so it's transformed this area, which was underused, into a major public space. And again, the centre, which was underused, becomes now a place for entertainment. And it's now possible to even hold some very large events there. For example, when London won the bid for the Olympics, there was a big celebration there. And of course, Chinese New Year is always celebrated there in London to thousands of people. The Reichstag in Berlin, this is a building that was heavily bombed and damaged during the war. And so it had a lot of history to it, and how we reinterpreted that history was quite important. But it's also important to mention that you can make these sustainable buildings. Here we're using solar panels, biofuel to operate the building, and also using thermal stores. So we can make them sustainable. And so basically the big spaces, we had the new debating chamber at the base, and above it we had incorporated this new public gallery. And so on top of that, we also preserved a lot of the history. There was a lot of graffiti, and I saw your initial reaction is to strip that away, but there's a lot of meaning in this graffiti. And while we couldn't keep all of it, a lot of it was documented, and some bits were kept for, to keep the memory of the building alive. And so the public gallery on the top, so it has two meanings. One, you can look down to the debating chamber below, so you can see what's going on. But also you can walk up the spiral ramp and get incredible views across Berlin. So this, again, has become one of the probably the most popular tourist attraction in Berlin. So it's not just regenerating the building, but the whole area around the building as well. So it's transforming all the businesses and things that happen around it. And I particularly like this image because you get this contrast of the old and the new, and how, working together you can create some very powerful projects. Back to London, this is the new headquarters for Bloomberg. So it replaced this old 1960s building for Legal and General. And then it's in a very historic part of London, very close to St. Paul's. But the idea was that it shouldn't be brash, it should be respectful to the history of the city and its surroundings, so it needed to blend in. And that came from Michael Bloomberg himself. And so you can see the modern building, it's still using traditional materials of that part of London, like the Portland stone and the bronze. But you're probably not aware there's a height restriction. We have in London these view corridors to St. Paul's, so the sort of dome of St. Paul's is never obscured from, I think there's about 7 key viewpoints around the city. So we had to adhere to that. But we also looked back at the history of the city, and this was an old map that we found that gave us a clue of how we could reintroduce this historic lane back into the city that had been lost. So we introduced 3 public squares on each of the corners, and then we cut through this arcade to reintroduce that historic route. And so you can see here where you've got this now pedestrianised route up to St. Paul's, and the opportunities that it gives you inside the building. So this space is actually where all the staff come as a socialising space, and they get this fantastic view of St. Paul's. And so at the base of the street, we reactivate the street, we introduce retail, and the arcade is now a new pedestrianised route full of retail. So it's bringing life into a new part of city. And so the squares themselves, you start to see the people occupying them, but it also has a dual role. This is also acting as a protective barrier for the building, but it's a social space in the city. And this is an old church by Sir Christopher Wren, the architect of St. Paul's. And so you can see how one of the squares is relating to that historic building and giving it. So you get this contrast of old and new sitting together quite comfortably. So the building itself was quite complex. So the idea was that all the staff could see each other, so it was all about communication. It was one big team. They wanted all the staff to visually see each other. So this led us to putting all the cores on the outside of the building, which is a bit counterintuitive when you want light and views. But it was all part of the company strategy. So we had to find innovative ways of how we dealt with the core being on the street and blocking off the light. So we designed these new lifts, so when you look at the building, all the views and the light actually still come through, and the lift isn't a big concrete structure blocking the light and the views. And so then looking at the facade, although we were using very traditional materials, we also looked at ways of naturally ventilating the building. So those bronze blades that you see there are bringing natural air into the building. And this gets sucked through up into that atrium space in the middle. And which you can see here from the CFD analysis. So the air comes in through the outside and up through the spiral in the middle. And so this is where the air comes out at the top. And you can see how that spiral also gives you three-dimensional views to the other floors in the office. So again, it's not just visibility across one floor, but between floors, which is important. And so this idea of the spiral goes through all the office spaces, connecting everybody, and down to the main entrance space at the bottom. And so the ceiling itself was designed. These were individually made ceiling panels that were to deal with the acoustics. It also deals with the cooling and the LED lighting. So it was a multifunctional ceiling. But you can see from the outside it has quite a dramatic effect. So one of the problems you get when you're working in London is there's a lot of history buried below, and as they were excavating the building, there was a lot of archaeological analysis done, over 80,000 hours of excavation done by hand. So there's a lot of history being discovered, and they found up to 63,000 pieces of history down there. But most importantly, they found this old Roman temple, the Mithraeum. But what was interesting about that, it was that it was in the wrong place. So when they did the original archaeological dig back in 1952, they actually moved it because that Legal and General building, which I showed at the beginning, they didn't want it to interrupt the car park, so they moved it. So the building was actually placed in the moved away from the site. So as part of our project, we wanted to return it back to its original location. So we incorporated it back into the scheme in its rightful location. And then Bloomberg created this public exhibition space. So it's free for everyone to enter, a nice piece of history, and they also did a fantastic light show and a sort of educational element to it. So if you're in London, you're free to go and visit. Closer to home in Shanghai, we had to look at the new Bund Financial Centre. So we were dealing in probably the most sensitive areas of Shanghai, the historic Bund. Interestingly, a lot of it was based upon buildings in the UK originally, as it was the original British concession. But you can see the site. It's a very complex site because it's right next to the historic old town. It's at the end of the Bund, and it's also leading the way to the new sort of financial centre. By this time, Pudong was pretty much well established, so you've got this sort of views from Pudong looking back over as well. So we were effectively finishing the Bund before the sort of start of the new financial centre. So we had to really look carefully at how the Bund was constructed and how we sensitively put a new building into this context. So we looked very carefully, and what we noticed was there was a lot of intricate stonework, a lot of highly crafted stonework, and some different textures as well. And the metalwork was even more detailed. It was particularly fine, and the level of craftsmanship is just fantastic. So we undergone an analysis of the Bund buildings and how they were constructed and what was the basic principles of that. And we analysed the sort of rhythm of the facade and the symmetry and the fact that there was 3 different zones that sort of, although they were very different buildings, there were some rules that kind of allowed it to be harmonious across it. So we had to understand that and work with that. So we started to create these blocks along the edge of the road, which gave us this sort of rhythm. So you can see the sort of the rhythm of the bund, the hierarchy of the flow of the roofs and the triple layers in the facade. But on the other side, we had the historic Old Town, and this was a lot smaller and a lot finer grained, so we had to respond in a slightly different way. So again, we did the same sort of analysis, which resulted in a much smaller, finer grain. So the development was stepping down to the grain of the Old Town. And so you get this much more finer richness than you get on the bund side, which is a bit grander. And then we introduced some of those textures and materials and craftsmanship that we saw on the buildings. We did it in a modern way, but it was still respecting the sort of feeling of the old. And then we'd have to think about how we introduce public space into the development. So now we've sort of done the perimeter, we wanted to create a central space for people to gather. So we created this sort of canyon that was fully enclosed and allows events to happen inside. And then we have to connect. We didn't want to block the development, block people from going to the river. The river's, the promenade is very popular, so we wanted to bring people through by opening it up. And then we had the two big towers to deal with. So there was many constraints. We had to be sensitive to Yew Garden. We had to be sensitive for the views of Pudong and sensitive to the views from the bund itself. So we didn't want the two towers to be merged into one enormous tower. So with all this was studied, and then you can see the sort of the final massing, and you've got this rhythm coming around with the sort of the spikes of the towers as it goes around. And then as a sort of a centerpiece, to sort of a gateway to the project, we did the cultural center. So this is bringing some, a public facility for people, a bit of more engagement rather just commercial activities. So the cultural center, I'm sure you've seen before, but this is based on traditional theatres and the wedding veil with the rods. Some people say it reminds them of bamboo. And you can see the triple layered screen, which changes depending on what's going on inside. So you can open it up to the view, or you can close it down if you want a black box exhibition. But more importantly, it has a lot of public space around it. So underneath the building, there's a nice cafe space that's opened up. And at the top, you've got the event space at the top. So it's not just a building itself, it's how people can use it and create space. And then we had the road. So when we got the typical master plan drawing, it had a road. It was divided into two plots. But we wanted it to feel like one cohesive district. So what we managed to do was create a sort of a shared space. So during the week, the road is still active, but at weekends, it gets transformed into a market. So, and it's quite popular at weekends, and it's quite amazing just by allowing these activities to take place, how you can transform parts of the city. And so there you can see the final composition in context with the historic bund. Further along the river, at the Suhurst Centre along Suzhou Creek, this was quite an interesting project. It's quite unusual to have a tower on its own. Usually towers are situated in areas within clusters. But I think what makes this special is the way it connects with everything around it. The key thing about this site, it had one of the best views of Shanghai. So you got views of where the Suzhou Creek meets the Huangpu River, and the view of Pudong, and a view of the bund. So it's probably, the best view. The problem with it is this whole area was under regeneration, and there were some heritage buildings on site as well. And we had some existing buildings behind us which blocked a lot of those views. So we kind of had to come up with a strategy for this building that addressed two problems. So we had the Pudong view, if you like, above 150 meters. But then the front view, which kind of addressed the park. So we kind of had a building that sort of looked one way at the lower levels and looked the other way at the higher levels. So we had to come up with a strategy of how to cope with that. And so this gives you an idea of the views around the building. So what we did was we used the lift core in the middle, and you can see how we've stepped it down. So where got the views across to Pudong, you can see there's no more lifts, so there's more office space at the back, and then you'll see that the lower floors look towards the park. So you can see the core is placed in the middle with the lifts, so we've got scenic lifts facing the park, and as the lifts drop off at the back, you get all this extra floor plate to experience the views. And with the two wings, we've got column-free office floor plate, which gives you ultimate flexibility. And so this is the actual photo of what you see at the top. But as I said, the context in which we're building is very important. So the Suzhou Creek is actually made up of a number of components. So you can see the old Shikumen buildings and the park in front. And there was a bit of industrial heritage to the site. It was full of warehouses and things like that. So we tried to make the architecture a bit slightly more industrial looking and a bit tougher, which you can see in this contrast with similar to the bridge, you can see that sort of slightly industrial feel. And so this was an old historic map of the site, and you can see the layout of the old Shikumen houses. And so you can see in this far corner here where we managed to preserve a section of them, and then we've got the park, and there's a little pop-up retail. So all under here is a whole retail development, and then there's an old temple situated here. So there's a lot of history going on with all this new development, and you can see how the old and the new start to come together, where you've got the modern art with the temple, and how the Shikumen houses have started to sort of influence the design of the retail underneath. And so all these Shikumen houses were repurposed and became retail and restaurants. And I quite like these images of this contrast of old and new sitting together. So it's one of the things in London where you get this, over time you get these layers of history where you get different periods of building all start sitting together but comfortably. And another thing, what they've done, which is very clever, is to start to bring art into these spaces. And I think that can really, if it's done very cleverly, you can see how that begins. It's not just another shopping mall, it becomes a place of culture. And I think how we use art and how we integrate it, I think ideas like this are really incredibly clever. And so art and the buildings also help people wayfind when they move around. You can get lost in a shopping mall, but once you see a glimpse of the sculpture or the building, you start to know where you are. Back to London. This is an area called Spitalfields. It's sort of east end of London, for those that know London. Quite a historic area, but it's a very business area. So the land values were getting quite high. So they wanted, this site was originally an old market. But the land values meant that market couldn't remain the size it was. It had to be, it was very, very valuable. So we were asked to design this office building here. So you can see how we've got the new office building, and then we introduced some retail here, which was being sensitive to the context of this street here. We have a smaller market retained here, and a famous Hawksmoor church to the side. So you can see how we've sensitively maintained the street frontage to create that feeling of the street, and kept the view of the historic church. And then the junction between the old and the new is with this glazed arcade, and you can see the glimpse of the church right on axis through that. And so then once the building was completed, we were asked to help rejuvenate the market. So we started to replan, and we designed a lot of the market stalls and installations in the market itself to freshen it up and give it a new lease of life. And then following that, there was almost like a third phase where we were asked to revisit it. Well, this was post-COVID, and things are changing where office space is now suddenly a lot of people working from home. There's more office space available. So what do we do with these old office buildings? One idea is to convert to residential. Another idea is to reshape the office space into something that's a bit more what people are looking for in modern office space. They want things that are a bit more like your living room, for example, a bit more casual. So we looked at taking apart a building we'd already done and trying to reshape it to create some new spaces. So, what was probably a fairly ordinary floor plate, we start to look at bringing in new areas of natural daylight, replanning it, more social spaces. And so, what was fairly standard floor plate now becomes full of light wells, and then by working our way down into the basement, we can start to activate it and connect to the existing retail around. So again, this is quite unusual for the building that's not that old. We're now looking at repurposing or reshaping projects that we've already done, and finding as trends change, we have to rather than knock it down, rework with the existing buildings. And so you can see how it's completely changed in appearance, but the basic bones of the building are still there. And we've seen a lot of change in retail. So this was it's called the Whiteley in Bayswater near Notting Hill. And what we've seen in London particularly is department stores were very fashionable, but then people are shopping more online. There's a resurgence of street retail. So these things are dying. So we were asked to look at this, and so it was finding a complete new uses. So what we did, we transformed it into a mixed-use building. And so at the base, you've still got some retail, but then we've got a hotel, we've got residential apartments, which reinvigorates this old building into a mix of uses. And that mix of uses also helps to bring life into the city. It rejuvenates that part. So rather than just being retail, you've now got people living there, shopping there, people visiting the hotels. And so this is all working with an existing building. This is quite an interesting project, another industrial heritage. This is in Madrid, and I think it was a form of power station. And what you find that some of these buildings had multiple uses over the years. So I think this one is even an armaments store at some point where they used to keep weapons. So it was in a poor state, but we were asked to refurbish and regenerate this building for Acciona, who are a sustainable energy supplier. So as part of that, we had to turn this into this, and it was done because they're a sustainable energy supply. It had to be done in a very sustainable way. So the materials that we're using, the way we're crafting the space, is all done in a very sustainable way. And again, you get this fantastic contrast of old and new sitting together. But as part of this works, there was also additional office space done onto the side, and that created a whole new public park for people as well. So we created space for the owner, but also something for the community. So you can see the new piece in the foreground there next to the original. And so you can see how that works in sections. So that's the original building with the new office space with the park on the top. And so you get this fantastic, which was probably quite a dead part of Madrid, now starts to rejuvenate itself. And I think, the power of working with old buildings, can be stronger than new builds sometimes. This is quite an interesting debate that was happening in London, and it highlights some of the problems that we have, and probably the need for a bit of legislation or some rulemaking, because this was an old department store, Marks and Spencer's in Oxford Street. Oxford Street, you're probably aware, the big street in London. So the debate goes, should we knock down the old one or build the new one? And so, as we started, they're saying, well, if you knock it down, you're going to lose 40,000 tons of CO2 into the environment, and then with the rebuilds, you're going to get another 41 tons. However, the argument on the other side for the new build is so they can make it even more sustainable than a retrofit, and therefore, over time, it will be more sustainable. And so this argument, really, if we're to bring in planning legislation to settle these arguments, we need to fix a couple of things. I think the first thing is there needs to be a consensus in how we measure carbon emissions, because whoever's arguing for or against will probably have a different methodology, and therefore the numbers don't tally. The other key thing is you kind of need to agree a payback period, because if you don't agree the timeline which your carbon emissions are counted, then it's a bit of a pointless argument, because retrofit will always win in the short-term argument, but the new build, if you're looking over 50 years or something, will probably be different. So I think there's a instead of it being just simply arguments, there's a need to bring some legislation and science into this debate. Which brings me to Battersea Power Station, which is a well-loved building, but was in a terrible state, a really terrible state. And just to give you some context, this is sort of Chelsea over here, and the American Embassy was recently built over here, so this whole area of 9 Elms is now massively redeveloped. But the Battersea Power Station was a well-loved building. It was a cultural icon. Everybody recognised it. The problem was, it was on the cover of Pink Floyd Animals, for those music fans. But the thing was, who wanted to take on such a big project? You've probably heard of the Tate Modern in London. They looked at it. They felt it was too big. And so over 40 years, what happened was different developers came, they looked at it and passed it on, sold it on to another developer. And so there were a whole range of things that were suggested: a theme park, casino, football stadium, cinema complex, the home for Cirque du Soleil, horse racing track, and others. And so this is, even a tower was proposed. So why did all these schemes fail? Eventually, it came to the Raphael Vanoli master plan, which got planning permission. And what saved it effectively was the fact that over time, each of the developers had acquired a bit more land until at such point there was enough land surrounding the asset that it would make financial sense to redevelop the power station itself. So this is a term that I try and explain, which is the conservation deficit. So if you have to spend a lot of money repairing an old building and then converting it, what is the value of that building once you've finished? If it's less than a new build would cost, then it's likely you wouldn't do the project. You know, we like to think developers have endless pockets, but that's not always the case, and they very rarely take on a project unless they can be confident of a profit. So there's different ways of dealing with this deficit, such as there's sometimes what we call a cocktail of funding from different sources that help to, heritage funds and regeneration funds that you can draw on to help address that balance. But they are more complex. And to take on a project like this is very complex and time consuming. So this was pretty much the state the building was at the end. And so one of the key sort of themes is that if a building gets to such a bad state that the structure is starting to suffer, then you've got an even bigger job to rescue it. So you can see here the roof isn't on. And when the roof is taken off, the water gets in, there's all kinds of problems start. So it was pretty much about to die, basically. So a Malaysian conglomerate basically bought the site, and and these are long-term projects, and that itself brings with its own problems. So this is the master plan, looking from above. So what we ended up doing was this piece of residential here, and we did the Apple offices in the middle section at the top. So just to try and explain, you might think, oh, why is this phase one and not this phase one? Well, they needed to generate some money to pay for phase two. So all this residential along the river is prime residential, river views, that needed to be done first to generate some income to start paying for all the works that needed to be done to phase two. And then we came along with phase three, and us and Frank Gehry on the other side. And some of the things you have to be careful of in long-term projects is you can get surprises. So we obviously had COVID in this period, and it's not just the work that's stopping. There's this graph basically shows you the cost of materials. So what happened was the cost of materials shot up during this period. So what you might have started off with a viable budgetary economic plan suddenly gets thrown out the window by situations beyond your control. So you can see here this is the phase two section. Well, this is the Frank Gehry bit, and this is our bit. So it's made up of three sections. So we've got the hotel at the front, then we've got the residences and the office section at the back. So again, a mixed use solution. And so again, you see, so this is the hotel at the front, and this connection between the power station. And when we designed the building, we actually used computer analysis and drones. So we figured out all the apartments either had a view of the river or a view of the power station, because that's where the value was. So the developer's looking for a way to maximize value but still create interesting architecture. So this is the drop-off as you come to the hotel, and then the restaurant at the top. And then the hotel's got a pool which overlooks the power station itself. So the power station is adding value. It's adding, although it's a lot of money to rejuvenate, it's adding value to the property. And so you can see how all the apartments are starting to be angled. And then on the rooftop, because you've got these amazing views across London, you can see the London Eye there. And we put this big garden on the roof as an amenity for the residents. We just had to stop the residents from jumping over into the hotel swimming pool. And so you can always see this context of the power station. And so all the public spaces are now animated with retail. So again, I keep talking about mixed use as a way to bring life into our cities. And so the power station itself originally was built in two sections. There was what they call A and B. And power station A was built in 1930s and it was completed in 1950s. So there's a lot of difference in the details between the two halves, which is quite interesting. So you can see even the power station itself had a rich mix of uses. But we were asked to look at the new Apple London headquarters in the power station. But which is interesting because of the cultural value and the iconic value of that asset, that is what drew Apple to that building. It's something very powerful that appealed to that kind of client. So I think these are things that are they're less tangible than just economics, but they make a big difference. So just to finish, we're just going to show a video of the Apple headquarters. And so it's starting with the clay. Obviously, we're going to use brick in this building. So we found out the quarry, the brick makers that made the original bricks for the power station. So again, bringing that level of craftsmanship. These are all handmade. And so the difficulty was everything had to get to site via lifts. So we had to make them in small sections. So all these are pieces of the columns that have to go up to this top section. And so they get basically jacked into place. And so all this double curvature, all these were specially handmade bricks. So the original building is now driving us to come up with new ideas and new solutions and new ways of designing. And you can see the atrium space above, and you can see the four towers from that atrium space. So again, you're connected back to that building. And so then you get you can see the towers there, and these little pods, meeting room pods. And so this glazed lifts take you down into the power station retail where the main entrance is. And then we had specially designed lighting that changes color through the day, so it's cooler in the morning and warmer at night, so it reflects the time of day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.